There have been many golden ages throughout history, which are defined as periods of peace, prosperity, and happiness. Early Greek and Roman poets used the phrase to describe points in history where art, science, and philosophy thrived, and where economic growth was unparalleled. However, while many thrived during these periods, especially the upper class, others were dramatically poorer, working hard for very little in return. Poverty was common during the Gilded Age and the Renaissance, and overtaxed peasants were struggling to keep the metaphorical lights on during the Enlightenment. So, today we're taking a look at what it was like to be poor during history's golden ages. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other historical periods you would like to hear about next. Okay, they say money can't buy happiness, but maybe watching this video can. Following the Middle Ages and the nearly 200 million lives lost to the Black Death, the period known as the Renaissance emerged in Florence, Italy. The Renaissance, which is French for rebirth, took place between 1400 and 1600 in Europe, as the feudal system began to crumble and explorers discovered new continents, resulting in the growth of the economy and development of technology such as printing and gunpowder. Ideas flourished, and artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo created masterpieces when they weren't busy doing karate and crushing pizzas. During the Renaissance, a person's class was determined by their income, job, and level of government power. Those factors also determined what sort of food they ate and the clothes they wore. Additionally, there was no job security for unskilled workers. If their performance wasn't up to snuff, or they didn't satisfy their employers in some other way, their pay would be cut or they would simply be fired. Back then, unskilled labor had no unions or guilds to help them out. Many poor people lived on farms, wore simple clothes, and ate basic food, such as bread or soup made from scraps. Their homes were usually very small, sometimes only having one room. The reality was vastly different from the image conjured by most Renaissance-era art, so don't look to paintings in museums for a broad and historically accurate view of the period. It's just art, more like pictures on social media than reality. The Gilded Age, in addition to being a riveting HBO soap opera, generally refers to the period between 1878 and 1889, during which great technological innovation led to the increased production of iron and steel, along with a higher demand for lumber, gold, and silver. This, in turn, led to the increased need for railroad development, creating new opportunities for entrepreneurs and more affordable goods for consumers. Business people such as John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie became very, very wealthy, thanks to the rapid economic growth and new technology benefiting the middle class. But writers Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner dubbed the time period following the Civil War as the Gilded Age for a reason. Political corruption and social problems ran rampant underneath all the dazzling innovations. You definitely don't want to be on the bad side of Mark Twain. During the Gilded Age, farmers struggled to pay their bills and feed their families. They faced challenges such as droughts, plagues of insects, falling market prices, and high interest rates. They often blamed the proliferation of railroads, land monopolists, mortgage companies, and manufacturers of farm equipment for their increasing plights. Industrial workers also struggled to make ends meet, working long days in dangerous conditions for little pay. From the bottom of the heap's perspective, the Gilded Age was harrowing. Meanwhile, industrialists and financiers built some of the most decadent homes in American history, but we did get some cool trains out of it. The Belle Époque in France lasted from the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 to the start of World War I in 1914. During this period, people were optimistic, and there was peace, economic expansion, and many technological, scientific, and cultural improvements. But who wants that when you can have a world war? In the middle of the Belle Époque, the Eiffel Tower was built for the 1900s World's Fair, the Moulin Rouge Cabaret entertained audiences, haute couture was developed, and all of these iconic French pieces of ingenuity became emblematic of the period. Additionally, the Art Nouveau movement took hold, featuring artists such as Paul Gauguin, Henri Matisse, and Pablo Picasso, all of whom are considered some of the most boundary-pushing and influential artists to have ever lived. But can they puncture a Capri Sun juice box on the first try? You probably saw this butt coming from a mile away, but not every French citizen benefited from the economic growth of the Belle Époque. The urban slums were rife with poverty, and rural peasants continued to suffer for decades following the period. According to a study conducted in 1882, 27% of Parisians were upper or middle class, while 73% were considered poor. Much of the lower classes lived in small quarters, were paid very little, and had to endure awful working conditions, and were not very healthy. C'est très mal, n'est-ce pas? In this period, many in the lower classes were left out of the rapid expansion and struggled to survive, while upper classes celebrated cultural things like artistic achievement. Take that, Picasso! Also referred to as the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment took place from 1685 to 1815. There were many scientific discoveries and inventions made during this period, as well as wars and uprisings such as the American and French Revolutions. This era included writings by French philosophers like Voltaire, as well as Thomas Jefferson's drafting of the Declaration of Independence. Scholars sought to spread knowledge and reason, and every single one of them could do a backflip on the first try. Probably. In other words, it was an era of great achievement and progress. But not everyone benefited. Many people in the modern era believe that poverty can be eradicated, but some throughout history thought it was necessary. During the 1780s, the European lower classes were the most impacted by droughts, harsh winters, and bad harvests. Many lived in poverty. And in 1820, some economists believed that 84% of the world's population lived in absolute poverty by their standards, and some intellectuals of the era thought the impoverished should stay there. Englishman Arthur Young, an agricultural economist and travel writer, wrote in 1771, "Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor or they will never be industrious." And 18th century Dutch political economist Bernard de Mandeville wrote, "To make the society happy and people easy under the meanest circumstances, it is requisite that great numbers of them should be ignorant, as well as poor." It's safe to say neither man was planning on running for president anytime soon. You can't win Ohio with that. These kind of elitist attitudes started to change with the French Revolution's call for liberty, equality, and fraternity. You see, the French Revolution was greatly influenced by the Great Enlightenment, which led to the desire for popular sovereignty and inalienable rights. Peasants often rebelled against the feudal system as they were forced to pay hefty taxes to the government, church, and landowners, and barely made enough to support their families. This is dramatized in the musical epic Les Misérables, highlighted by the dulcet singing of Russell Crowe. Vive la France! During the Victorian era, which took place between 1837 and 1901 and was named after, well, Queen Victoria, there was peace in Britain. The country was not involved in any wars with other countries, and there were substantial advancements in technology, art, literature, and science. The British Empire was trading goods and making money, and railroads contributed greatly to economic prosperity. It was a period of global imperial expansion, and the country established colonies all over the world, particularly in Asia and Africa. But with all this came a huge population increase in the major cities. But not enough housing. Lower-class people smushed and cramped into slums with dirty water. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis ran through these populations, and the infant mortality rate was disturbingly high. Writer Kello Chesney described these slums as crannies of obscure misery. Thought that was a Panic at the Disco song. And if a kid wasn't dying, they were working. Much of the Victorian era's increase in industrialization was powered by good old-fashioned child labor. Poor kids worked in dangerous jobs like coal mining, factory maintenance, chimney sweeping, and any other tasks that could be performed more quickly by workers with smaller hands, without much regard for how easily those hands could get lost. And these weren't 9-to-5 jobs. The shifts were more like work until you collapse into a machine press. Several acts were passed during this period to curb the exploitation of child labor, but for many youths, the damage was already done. That said, the Victorian era eventually inspired steampunk, and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen fans might say it was a fair trade. So what do you think? Which of these golden ages could be the worst to live in? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.